But what a guy talks about is important. Guy, what you said is really important because context is the reason why so many people have thought there's more there than what was uncovered in the Warren Commission, and then later in the subsequent investigation into the RFK assassination. Because it's not just the event itself. If you just look at it in a bubble and you look at each individual event as just separate, you can make a lot of assumptions that way. You could say, oh, well, there's no evidence of this, there's no evidence of that, and you can't prove a negative. But when you do a little bit deeper digging into what was going on at that time, who was involved, the whole idea of these mafia figures paying for all of these camps, and that's not conspiracy theory. That's government fact. That is true.
Right.
And you see what they did to a guy like Carlos Marcello.
Right.
Dumped him in Guatemala. They still to this day don't know how he got out of the jungle and what made it back into the United States.
Right.
People like that, you don't play with them. It's not just going after their business. You made it personal at that point. Yeah. And when they had these means and opportunities and all of these disgruntled trained people at their disposal, plus the infrastructure of the camps, getting them weapons, things like that, it doesn't sound as crazy as some people might think, does it?
That's right. You know, I'd be remiss if I didn't add this little touch. My dad, who's now 81 years old, was a huge fan of the Kennedys in the, like most people in New England at the time, grew up just idolizing the Kennedys. Mm-hmm. In fact, he saw JFK from a distance on an airfield one time. And, anyway, he refused, even to this day, he refuses to accept a conspiracy behind the murder of either one of these two guys. Mm-hmm. And he and I have had a friendly and oftentimes lively debate about it. And, right. But I'm separate. I was born after both those guys had been killed. So right. I didn't have the personal connection that he did. And so I can look at it a little differently. I can look at it like you're saying with the hindsight of, well, all this evidence is coming out and where there's smoke, there's fire and that sort of thing. He can't. And he once told right. me a couple of years ago when I was writing my RFK book, he said, I was laying out all this evidence to him and he finally got really upset. And he goes, Guy, listen, I don't believe it because I don't want to believe it. Right. That's the bottom line. And I think a lot of right. people of that generation felt that way. It was such a traumatic and horrific event when JFK was killed in his prime. And then Bobby, 5 years later, Martin Luther King, then Bobby, in such a short time thereafter. And of course, all the assassinations of the 60s with Malcolm X and Medgar Evers and all that.
Right.
I think it just became too much for a lot of people.
Right. Yeah, because there was a lot of huge shocks. These were earth-shaking events that right. took place. And right. it's rather difficult to try to say someone was behind all of this. But then, and I think you probably arrived at this too, with your massive amounts of research into that era, I don't think it was somebody from the top down. I don't think it was a bunch of people in a smoky room who decide everything that happens. I think that right. that if you make it sound like that, then it does sound ridiculous. Right. I think for me, in my research, I feel that it was a bunch of people who had the means, who had been aggrieved, who had a means to an end. They had the people on the ground who could literally do this stuff. So it was more of an option for them. I don't think Dulles was involved in the assassination. I mean, and there were people who say, it also goes to the other extreme where there have been people who've done a lot of hard work and they said, well, all the guys who were at the Watergate break-in were in Dealey Plaza that day. Right. Once you start talking about that stuff, it's a little bit too neat. And as a crime writer and as a historian, stuff usually doesn't happen that neat.
You're right. And, but what makes it tough, and everything you just said, I agree 100% with, and I feel the exact same way you do. The only thing that makes things difficult when it comes to that is you've got E. Howard Hunt on his deathbed, supposedly confessing to the fact that he was on the grassy knoll, that he was one of those guys that was investigated, right. stopped and investigated after the shooting, and he actually was him, he said. And so when you find that stuff, then you're like, oh boy, Now, were these just the ravings of a dying man just trying to get notoriety for himself before he dies? You know,
Hmm.
because he knows he's not going to suffer any consequences because he's about to die anyway. I mean,
Right.
it could be that. It could be, is he trying to promote a book his son's going to write and make $1 million? I mean,
Right.
you know, the motives could be all over the place. But I think that
Right.
you have to ultimately look, like you said, with an appraising eye of a crime investigator and a historian and say, okay, what is realistic here? What is plausible? What makes sense? You know, and you look at it and say, I don't believe that it was an official CIA operation to kill either one of these guys.
No.
I don't believe it was an act of the government. Although there are, like you said, people who do believe that. But I do believe that there were rogue elements within both the mafia and the CIA who, as you said, they were good friends. They knew each other from having worked together before.
Hmm.
They have an ambiguous morality at best.
Right.
And so, you know, they thought, hey, we need to have this done for the betterment of our country, for the betterment of our lifestyle, and we have the means to do it. And I
Right.
think that's where we're looking at. And they had the means, they had the training, they had the resources. You
Hmm.
know, that's where I focused on too.
Yeah, me too. And it's also important to look at, as you were talking about earlier, the overall mood of the time, because you had people who were genuinely, including Hoover, always afraid of the communists, because Hoover
Right,
came up during the Red Scare, the real Red Scare of the 20s and 30s, when there were terrorists who were blowing things up. There were
right,
people who were communists and trying to start a revolution in the country. So he was afraid of them from then. And then that fear only grew after World War II, and then the expansion of communism throughout Southeast Asia and throughout Eastern Europe.
right.
So, and you also had the Joe Kennedy angle where he was, a lot of people forget this, he was the ambassador to England who spoke to Hitler and said, oh, there's no war. He
Yeah,
crafted a lot of the appeasement policies. So a lot of people, if you watch this great movie called 13 Days,
yeah,
Kevin Costner plays a supporting role in it, but it was excellent. And one of the guys who was against Kennedy uh, giving in during the Cuban Missile Crisis said appeasement runs in families. And
yes.
that was something that a lot of people had in the back of their minds, because that was probably, and I don't think they were doing it, the people who were involved in this were doing it for purely patriotic pursuits. But I think that did play a role in it, because when you have that kind of worldview, you've got all these means at your disposal, the unthinkable becomes plausible.
Absolutely. And you are 100% correct on that. And there were and by the way, that 13 Days, what a great movie. I've seen it probably a dozen times.
Great film.
And it is great. I love it. And that's true. That there was a big feeling in the country at that time that the Kennedys were soft on communism. You
Right.
look at, I mean, there were people that wanted us to have World War III during the Cuban Missile Crisis, and
Right.
the fact that Kennedy evaded that, you know, he painted it as a win with Khrushchev backing off and stuff, even though we had to pull our missiles out of Turkey.
Right.
But many people still felt like, hey, he's soft. He's soft on communism, and you know that was a real strong undercurrent. And then, you know, in my research for the book, I came across a lot of stuff from the John Birch Society,
Right.
and they were now they're still around today, but they were very active in the 50s and 60s. A huge fall. In fact, there were over 1,000 people in the Los Angeles, the LAPD, who were members of the John Birch Society at that time.
Right.
Yeah, and they were very strong on the communist angle. They were very focused on this communist connection and all that. And they were after the Kennedys constantly about their alleged softness in dealing with communism. So there was
Right.
a huge movement. And then, of course, you tie in civil rights and the fact that Hoover would try to connect Martin Luther King with communism and, you know, and all that stuff. And you know, both John and Bobby Kennedy tried to work with Martin Luther King, and they had a fairly good relationship. Particularly Bobby had a better relationship with Martin Luther King than JFK did, but they were seen as trying to work with them and going right against the whole system that had been in place for decades, for most of the history of the country. This whole integration thing and all that. It's all interlaced, and you can see why there's so much there that just feeds all these conspiracy angles that you can look at.
Right. And it's always the tertiary characters that are involved in something like this that when you have to go back through a lot of the records to see who showed up when, what did they talk about, what didn't they talk about. And now that it's become a little bit easier for people to do that with the advent of the internet, I think that you're seeing a lot more about these secondary people who've been involved that really do add to the conspiracy theories that have been left off over the years. When you look at people like the Paynes, when you look at people like the Morenshield, you kind of say, and they're all involved with Oswald. You're like, Oswald was a nobody. Where did all these people pop up from? I mean, why deal with him? It was, and then that's what spurs the creative types like us to do the research, because that is important, and then extrapolate. Because I'll tell you, I had one vision of my book when I was starting to write it that went in a completely different direction once I started doing a little bit of research. And then when I really dove in, it took on a life of its own. And I know that you have recently centered on the RFK assassination. Kennedy was killed in 1963 and Bobby was killed in 1968. So why don't you tell us a little bit about your research about that tragic event?
Let me give you one thing. Can I swear on this?
Sure. Go ahead. Oh. Yeah, go ahead.
All right. There was a guy by the name of David Sanchez Morales. And okay. I knew you'd know who he is. So this guy is a CIA assassin. Okay, this is real. I'm not making any of this stuff up. He was involved in, now the CIA, their mandate is supposed to be all overseas. They're not supposed to do anything on American soil. Wink, wink.
Which is why the mob was running the camps. And
absolutely.
That's fact. That's not conspiracy theory.
Absolutely. So this guy Morales, David Sanchez Morales, was involved in major assassinations throughout the 50s and into the 60s. And his attorney, he was this almost a stereotype, really, of a cold warrior. He's a hard drinker, party guy, strong man,
scary looking dude.
Scary looking dude, and a real intimidator. You don't want to cross this guy. And so anyway, he was good friends with his lawyer, and he got drunk one night. This is in the 70s now, after both the Kennedys are dead. And I know you know what I'm going to say here. But his attorney an attorney is not going to go on record in a subpoena or make any sort of statement. He's not going to lie. So he, because he's an attorney, he knows that he could be in trouble. So he's actually on record of having said that I was drinking with him down in Miami, and he got up in a drunken rant, and he says, "Let me tell you something." He goes, "I was in Dallas when we got the motherfucker, and I was in LA when we got the little bastard."
Right.
Well, bang. Now, in reading furthermore, I was able to, he plays a big part in my book. And I was able to find that because his job was assassinations, one of his assignments that came down from the CIA was to kill Castro. So he had developed a plan way back in the early 60s because Castro used to frequent this one restaurant, this one hotel restaurant. And he would it was his habit to go in through the pantry and to shake hands with all the kitchen staff. And so Morales developed this plan to have an assassin hiding in the kitchen pantry in the closet area and spring out and kill Castro as his plot. Now, this plan was ultimately rejected by his superiors because they said, well, how's the assassin going to escape thereafter? And if the assassin is caught alive, then we're afraid he's going to point the finger at us. So they scrapped the plan.